Hi, and welcome to Live with OAIB, a conversation where we discuss critical HR challenges that leaders are often facing today. We use our 40 plus years of experience in HR consulting and executive coaching to go deep on topics that are top of mind but often avoided. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tonya Roberts, COO, executive coach, and human capital strategist. I'm an integrator who takes a holistic approach to turn your vision for the organization or yourself into solutions that create inclusive cultures where all not only feel but know they belong and can thrive. My superpower has been the ability to help my clients clearly articulate their needs and goals and then break them down into actionable steps that don't overwhelm them. I'm joined by Tawana.
Good afternoon. My name is Tawana Bhagwat. I am the CEO and Principal Consultant of OAIB. I am a visionary who believes in the power and promise of equity and helps organizations become places where everyone has a deep sense of belonging. I cut through the background noise and coach leaders so they can make the shift into being their authentic selves, rooted in their own personal power. I would say my superpower is helping people become aware of their own blind spots so that they can put the oxygen mask on themselves first and then make others feel safe, heard, and inspired. So, what are we talking about today, Latanya?
Well, many of our clients are returning to the office using this hybrid model where they spend 2 to 3 days remote and 2 to 3 days in the office. And on January 11th, House Republicans introduced the Stopping Home Office Work's Unproductive Problems or Show Up Act, which could require all federal agencies to return to their pre pandemic office arrangements.
Mm.
That's right. So if you were in the office 4 days, 5 days, or 3 days out the week before the pandemic 3 years ago, you're going to be returning, could possibly be returning again soon to that. Now, some people love the idea and some hate it. So we're
Yeah,
going to talk about the pros and cons today. All
this is
right.
a good one. I'm really excited about this topic.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because prior to the pandemic, OAIB didn't have a physical office space, right? We were a home-based business. Assistants came into your home office and worked from there. But we actually opened our office 6 months ago, last summer. And I just want to know, as a business owner, what was your thought process to have a team transition to being 100% remote to actually coming into the office?
Yeah, this is a good question. And like all employers, we are not, you know, shy from having to deal with the same challenges that everyone else has dealt with. But I can tell you that a significant amount of our team were hired during the pandemic, like most, right? And we never really had a chance to connect in person in an
Mhm.
office setting. I recall the value of what that meant in earlier in my career. And I know that there are pros and cons to that. It was
Mhm.
important to me as we are growing exponentially that reconnecting was critical to our work. I also believe that it will help enhance what I would consider a good culture. And I could be biased, but I do think that we have a good culture. And it was something that I wanted for my organization. As we are fast growing, right? It's fast paced because we are supporting so many others. It was very important for me to ensure that we were able to teach, learn, support, develop, and grow with each other as we are doing this for our client. And I wanted to role model what I was coaching to our clients. Also, I was really tired of scheduling Zoom meetings for the smallest things. Slack replaced my voice, right? I questioned if my team got my voice sometimes, or even if I got theirs, or required a bit more intentionality, as we all know, to make sure that we're making those efforts to connect and do it in a way that is meaningful and significant. But in the grand scheme of things, we are in the people business, and people are social beings, even if you are introvert, right? So, in my opinion, I felt like our productivity, our innovation or creativity, the interpersonal skills, and how we operate as a team, and I like to say a unit, has increased since we have returned to work. And so I am very pleased with the choice I made and how the team just jumped right in. And it wasn't because, they didn't have some reservations, but in
Mhm.
general, I can see a significant difference since we've been back in the office.
I agree. I mean, just the ability to kind of sit in the office or just can hear conversations or turn to your coworker who's next to you
Yeah.
definitely has some of its advantages. And I've seen the growth in our team members too, and just especially those that were hired during the pandemic and not having that chance to see what it's like and really experience our full culture. Now, we know that many of us can agree that most organizations that did not already operate in a remote or hybrid culture experienced some challenges when they were forced to go 100% remote 3 years ago.
Yeah.
What benefits can people look forward to when returning to the office?
So I think I highlighted a few of them that I'm actually experiencing and seeing. But the number one thing is I believe there will be an increase in productivity, right? And most would say, including myself, having started this business in my home, is that working from home can be a distraction. And sometimes there needs to be, a physical barrier, not just a door that separates your home life from your work life. I would also say better collaboration, to be able to turn to a colleague and have a quick discussion, or if a colleague's overhear a conversation and they're able to chime in or provide perspective that maybe you didn't have and you would have to get by scheduling a Zoom, doing a Teams, some kind of messaging. I also believe, at least what I'm hearing for those that are returning, even though they may be resisting, that there is a better work-life balance. Because I found that when I'm at home, I am working and then I'll go out and see something in the living room or in the kitchen. I'll pick it up, I'll wipe down, I'll do this, and it's a distraction to some degree. And then I'm back at work, and then I'll go out of my office again and come back in, right? So I'm never really turning off. And I would tell you that it is required that we turn off from work. And to some degree, coming to work allows you to turn off a bit from your home life. I believe in the more social interaction as well. I mentioned that we are social beings, right? Social interaction is so critical. It actually helps us to continue to build on our interpersonal skills. And if you're not practicing them, you could sometimes show up a little awkward. Some may describe it in other words. You've heard people say, oh, they're socially awkward, right? But we've lost some of those skills that have been fundamental to how we've done work. I would also say there's a reduce in stress level because we're managing work and home all in the same setting. Um, an improved mental health for some, maybe not for others. And better physical health. We like to call it the COVID weight, but all of us have suffered from being still. But when you're at work, you don't just, kind of go out of your office or away from your cubicle to get to the bathroom or to get a drink of water. You got to get up and at least, walk 20, 25 steps. Versus if you're at home, you may be 5 steps away or walk to the kitchen or have to go upstairs or downstairs. So forcing a bit more physical health. And then I mentioned this earlier, but an increase in creativity. There is nothing like brainstorming amongst like minds and coming up with a better solution than maybe one you had if you would have just thought through it by yourself.
I love that. I know when I do come into the office, it's definitely a different vibe, right? I
Mhm.
like, talking to everyone and just kind of feeding off of the energy of the room. And we certainly get a lot done when we're all together. But some will say that, being in an office is truly an outdated model. It's a tool to micromanage or maintain control. At least that's what I'm hearing when I look at the studies or I go on the blogs, the discussion boards. A lot of people are saying that. But what are you hearing from employers when they're discussing their main concerns about continuing the work from home model?
Well, I would tell you that for one, people are complaining because we got used to not having to get in our cars, right? So the commutes are too long, which creates its own expense. Of course, when we had the hike in gas prices, we had to really think about where we go and make choices. Had that happen and we were, everyone's back to work, it could have created some hardship. But in general, it still could be expensive with parking, etc. There's no flexibility in work days, so people are really looking at. I have flexibility to get this done, and if I didn't, I had these extra few minutes or hours that I can get back online and get a task done. Versus, I might now leave my computer in the office versus having it at home. Slow or outdated technology. Even though we had the pandemic, technology have now become just how we do everything that we do. Are the employers prepared to update Wi-Fi or any of their meeting schedulers, etc.? So there is a concern there. Their coworkers are too chatty, right? So before I can get my work done because I'm at home and I'm focused and I got my blinders on. And now I'm happy to see my colleagues, right? Is we're in a setting and we're socializing, but now it's too much or more than what I recall. Or their colleagues aren't I need to work with may not be on site on the days that I'm on site. And so we be missing each other when I really need to connect and was hoping to. So, with all of these, as we talk about transitioning, the employer as well as the employees would need to take these things into consideration to ensure that there is, this combination of taking into consideration there's a transition
Mhm.
that's occurring, and we got to give some grace to that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a lot of the benefits and some of the watch outs for
Mhm.
that an employer is thinking about in terms of returning to the office and things you have to take into consideration when you're making that decision. But they're not the only ones that are excited about coming into the office. There's
Yeah.
actually a group of people, the team members that are ready to return to the
Mhm.
office. What are you hearing that they're saying?
So I know that there's a lot of surveying that's happening, right? It started the conversation or 2 years ago, actually, where people have been surveying. If we thought about, if we got past the pandemic, how would you feel, right? So a lot of that. And I would tell you that less than 10%, kind of had even an open mind to consider returning. But there's been a shift that we're hearing that people are really around this 50% range are excited to come back. And I would tell you they're ready to come back to the office. The number one reason is human interaction, right? Team camaraderie, in person collaboration, and engagement. Those things become when you think about how we get our work done. And I'll continue to say this, that we're social beings, and there's not a lot of roles where you're, just truly not collaborating with other people. And that's how some thrive. I'm going to try to make sure I always say some, because I can imagine others hearing me go, no, I'm an introvert. I don't need it. I'm great. I can get my work done and I'm okay with never having to talk with anyone. But we all know that that's not a true reality. In, I would say, 99.9% of the time. We got to talk and interact with other people. What I will tell you is that there are some things, some adjustments, though, that we're going to have to make in order to really make this transition work. But I would tell you that people are looking forward to those impromptu face to face time, right? For being a part of a community that they can look, feel the energy, right? Transmitting in a room with exchange, that's socializing with their colleagues. And then scheduling in person meetings versus scheduling Zoom also feels very differently than it had been over the last 3 years.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the word introvert a few times here, and a lot of people
Mhm.
will say, it's all the introverts that are saying go home and let's stay at home. It's so much better there. Well, I'm an introvert. Tawana is very much so an extrovert, y'all. And I will say, from an introvert perspective, while yes, I do love working in my quiet space when I really need to function and concentrate, I
Mhm.
do miss being around people
Mhm.
I don't need to come into the office every day, but
Mhm.
it's a little too much for me.
Mhm.
But a couple days a week, I don't mind that because
Right.
there's so many benefits to it, right? And another thing that people think about when we're having this conversation about returning to the office, the word productivity comes up
Mhm. Mhm.
all the time. So I just want to give you all some statistics on productivity. And there's a lot of information out there from the Department of Bureau or the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, great places to work. And so many companies have done some research and report outs on productivity and what it's like to be at home. But one in particular, the OWL Labs, in collaboration with Global Workplace Analytics, they publish an annual state of remote work report. And in their fifth one, which was published in 2021, so the height of everything, really getting to understand what people are thinking while they're in this remote work environment, and then starting to make that switch into coming back into office. So they polled 2,050 US people, full time US workers, and here's what they said. 90% said that they're at the same productivity level or higher when
Mhm.
working from home compared to coming in the office. So out of that 90%, 67% were more productive working from home. 24% said it's about the same, and 1% felt less productive. Again, that's only 2,000 people, but that was the sample. So during that time, people were starting to say, you know what, I've got a rhythm here. I've kind of figured this thing out, but we can't deny some of the benefits of actually coming into the office, because it's really about how do you set up your work environment. If you've got a lot of background noise, you're not going to be as productive. Okay. 55% also said that on average, they work more hours than at the office.
Yeah.
Now, I remember this survey that went out. Gosh, I think it was maybe 2 months into the pandemic. And this particular company had surveyed all of their senior managers and above at the time. And they really wanted to understand, well, what's the difference now? And a lot of times, what happened was there were a lot of things that were shifting in terms of, well, how do we support the team members? How do we make sure they have this work life balance and they're getting the support they need? But what happened as a result of that was, people, especially the managers and above, had to take on more work, which meant more hours, right? And so it actually wasn't doing them any good, because
Right.
usually, and I hate to say this is the bulk of the people, but usually when you're at the upper levels, you have more at home responsibilities.
Mhm.
You have children, you're a caretaker, whether a child or an adult, or you just have a little bit more going on. So if you're averaging 8 hours in the office, but then when you come home and you still want to be a high performer, you add on another couple of hours of work, it leads to burnout,
Yeah.
right?
Quickly.
Quickly. So
Mhm.
in this report, 30% of men and 21% of women said that they actually worked an extra 2 hours per day, right? But the key thing here was, yeah, they're working extra 2 hours a day, but a lot of the organizations aren't really concerned about burnout. And we know now burnout and mental health is a real issue, because,
Absolutely.
right, 3 years later, we're really starting to see some of the effects of what's been happening over the last few years and some of our shortfalls, as well as some of the wins that have been going on.
Mhm.
So we've discussed a lot about the benefits. We've talked a little bit about some of those drawbacks here, but what are some other downsides of returning to an office environment?
So I would say, as employers are thinking about returning um, back to work, it is so critical for them to understand that the office environment has to be conducive to
Mhm.
have people back in the office. And before they can, begin to return people, which I know most of them are doing, they need to look at their spaces. To be quite honest, for those organizations that survived COVID, so let's be clear about that, because there was a lot that closed down and financially was burdened with having space that was not being occupied. So they went 100% remote to get some of that financial burden off their books. And they too are now looking at, do we return? Do we keep everyone when they committed to be at 100% and having to reverse their decision? Right. So we have lots of dynamics going on. But for those that have kept their space, they now have to consider things, and particularly around what's our policy and how clean is it around people getting sick? Because today, a common cold isn't a common cold, right? And to be quite honest, people who got a cold and stayed out from work were frowned upon. They're like, it's just a cold. Oh, I don't want to make anyone sick. No one really cared about that to the degree that we do now after, you know, coming out of COVID. And I use that in air quotes because I don't know what coming out of COVID really means. Um, I would also say so ventilation becomes something that needs to be discussed and taken into consideration. Rearranging the layout of space now, we need to look at how much open space we have, how much focus space we have, trying to get sunlight into, as we are learning that vitamin D is so important, and how do we get natural light in when we're having people in the office, the number of people that are in the office at one time. All of these things become a discussion point, that if the employers have not taken these things into consideration. And then the flip side of that is around technology. Maybe before we could just go and tap you on your shoulder and jump into a huddle room. But if the huddle rooms are now, focused work areas, having a scheduler, right, in place becomes even more critical. Having, the Wi-Fi systems updated because they haven't been touched or, used and really used in the last 3 years. So there's so many things that has to be taken into consideration. And just note to employers, your staff knows these things and they want to hear that you have taken them into consideration. They also want to know about cleaning. I should say that one, right?
Mhm.
Like, we have to clean more frequently than we have in the past. And policy around washing your hands. And if you're sick for anything these days, stay home, give yourself grace, but also lessen the exposure to those that may be in the office. So
Mhm.
there's so many things to take into consideration. And my ask, if there's anything that I've mentioned thus far that you have not thought about, please consider, there's many more, but please consider as you begin to invite your employees back to the office, so that safety is the number one thing that can become a deal breaker for employees returning back to work.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you brought up the policy around cleaning.
Yeah.
I'm gonna double click on policy updates that need to be made around
Oh, yeah.
PTO and sick time.
Mhm.
At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of amendments were made to policy around being able to take time off if
Yeah.
you had COVID and it didn't count against your PTO or sick time.
Mhm.
Recently, a lot of companies have rescinded that. However, COVID's still around.
Yeah.
It's not going anywhere for a long time. So by now forcing people to take the sick time off, you're putting them in a position where they can't get the rest that they need. And fortunately, I haven't had COVID, but my daughter had it. She was down for a couple of weeks. And I can't imagine having to work and be fully present working. You know, some of us are superheroes here and can do it. I'm not one of them. All right. To be fully present and work, that takes away from your time to heal, but also your recovery time. So,
Mhm.
as you're looking at things that you need to take into consideration with returning to the office, make sure that you're looking at your sick and your paid time off and see, do you really need to revert back to pre-pandemic policy when we're actually not out of this pandemic? COVID is still here. So what can you do to let people know that, hey, we do have your back? And if you have COVID, please do not put the rest of us at risk by coming to the office because you've run out of sick time.
Mhm.
That is something I really want to stress. I've been reading a lot in these discussion boards where people are really concerned and saying, I'm just going to show up to work.
Right.
And that's horrible for people who have compromised immune systems. If they get COVID, that can lead to death. That could lead to long-term hospitalization, and is something that is very serious, and we need to keep that in mind as we are making these adjustments.
Can I just add one thing to that? Communication is going to be so critical on so many levels. Checking in with people, and I don't mean a survey.
Mhm.
We are hearing it so much. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired of surveys,
Mhm.
right? And this is where interaction, our social skills, right, may be a little rusty, but checking in on the human being as
Mhm.
a human being, not as a staff member, right? Or not because it's your job as a manager, because we don't know pre-COVID or post-COVID where people are. And so to just check in with your team, to check their mental health,
Mhm.
to check their spirit health, right? To check in on how they're feeling because they could be making choices. I heard someone shared a story with me where an employee did come into work and
Mhm.
they did had symptoms of COVID, but they were planning a trip, right? And they didn't want to use vacation because they had used up all of their sick days. And so they made a choice that could sacrifice the whole
Mhm.
versus having a conversation with their manager to speak to how flexible we can be. So flexibility is going to be so critical in the success of
Mhm.
transitioning your employees back to work.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we pretty much know that this hybrid work environment thing, it is the next normal for many of us. If you have the option of working from home, if you want to be an employer of choice, you will offer it, right?
Yes.
Because we're still in that great stand up, or otherwise known as the great resignation, where people are leaving and they're looking at the benefits package and that flexibility, because a lot of people love the flexibility of working from home and they can find someone that will allow them to do it.
That's
So we
right.
need to right. So we need to start thinking about these compromises, right? So what are some good compromises for people who would like to remain remote and employers or leaders who want their team members to actually come back in the office? So they're a little bit misaligned here.
Yeah. So I'll go back to understanding what flexibility means for both the employer and the employee, and finding some happy medium is critical. I would tell you from all the conversations that I'm in, the happy medium is the hybrid, right? Where 2 to 3 days you're in the office. That then lends itself to the scheduling becoming so critical, right? So also flexibility on which days I come in, the times that I come in, understanding that from what the needs are of the employer versus the needs of the employees. And again, there is a happy medium. We can make this work. It was going to take the employer and the employee to be open. Getting clear on deliverables and how collaboration show up will also be super important, right? Because if there's a team of 5 and only 3 are in on Wednesday and the other 2 come in on Thursday, but you're working on a project that you have deemed is critical for that collaboration, or to have everyone in a room for preparation for a client meeting, you name it, those expectations need to be shared up front. It may not be every week. It could be because of its project base, etc. The physical spaces I mentioned before, there's a compromise to where I'm sitting in shared space, or I'm just so uncomfortable, or I have a compromised immune system that I prefer to be in, right? An office where before I only sat in a cubicle. Could employers accommodate that? The policies around managing those that are sick, to your point, is going to be super critical. And that one, to my HR counterparts, putting your head together with leaders, looking at standard best practices. And I say that with my shoulders hunched because we're creating them as we go, because this is new. We haven't been in this space, becomes so critical in understanding your employee base, listening to the things that they're concerned about and addressing them, and then being open to change, because it could fit for now and it may not fit for later, because we've evolved, things have changed, right? Because they will, and we have to be open to that.
Absolutely. And some people are really leaving it up to their employers at the team level, or their employees at the team level, or even at the individual level, of whether or not they choose to return to the office. As we know, a lot of people have moved away. They've moved out of the city, they moved to the suburbs or even more rural areas, or vice versa. And actually, what I found when I was doing some research is that it was some of the more seasoned generations that decided to come into the city,
Mm-hmm.
and the millennials and the Gen X were moving out of the city. So
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was very interesting. I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up here, because since it is optional, right? And a lot of people are trying to make that decision of, do we bring people in? Do we make it optional? Do we make it mandatory? There's also going to be some people that, yeah, it is required for them to come into the office, and they say that's unfair. What would you say to those team members that are saying, "Hey, it's unfair. I have to come in, but my coworker on a different team does not have to come in"?
Right. Yeah, I would caution leaders on this one. At this point in the transition, I would make it required that everyone come in or fall under this policy. For those that have chosen to move out of state, right? That was a personal decision that they've made
Mhm.
for themselves, not because the company, right, asked or endorsed. We had no idea how long we would be under the pandemic, and we wanted people to be able to do work. And we also know that people moved to support families, right? There was hardship that was happening. There were a lot of different dynamics. So I would say the company again has to understand their employee base, but you have to be very careful in making exceptions,
Mhm.
right? And this gets dicey, right? And I would say this is why they pay HR and the managers the big bucks, because you're going to have to weigh in this decision very carefully. The
Mhm.
other thing that I would encourage them to do is, if you do make a decision that will have people to have to relocate or move, giving them a notice, giving them time to transition that feels fair and equitable. But knowing that we can't have too many exceptions,
Mhm.
because then there's really not a policy, right? We're
Right.
literally just taking every single case as it is. And if that's the case, then it's unfair to me that I'm local, therefore I have to come in. But Latanya, for example, is on our team and sits in Atlanta. Why doesn't she have to come in? And who asked her to move? And that's not my concern. So you get into these things, and you, of course, can have public discussions about them. So we have
Mhm.
to understand what demographics is not in town or in, and then there are roles that are okay to be remote.
Sure.
And that's okay too. And you could decide that there are some roles that are okay to be remote, and you declare that, and that's what they are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Lots of dynamics, though. Lots of dynamics that employers are working through, as each case is individual, that could impact the collective.
Absolutely. And one thing that we do have to take into consideration is that proximity bias that pops up.
Yeah.
When you have people that are co-located, they do get the benefit of building those relationships a little bit easier.
Yeah.
They build the trust. They build in opportunities organically to be able to support their leaders and those decision makers. So one thing that we have to do is make sure that we can combat that proximity bias by making sure that our policies, our practices, and procedures are in place to support that. So, for example, when you're looking at your performance management systems and how you're rating employees, make sure that it's not just based on people or is biased towards those that are actually able to sit together versus those that are no longer co-located with the rest of your team.
Mhm.
How are you actually selecting people for certain training opportunities, mentorship, coaching? All of that plays a factor as well. So we can go really, really deep here on all the decisions that you have to take into consideration. But no, it's not a simple decision for anyone, any organization, of what they want to do and how they move forward. So just keep that in mind as well. Um, Tawana, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. So, what is one last thing you want to give the audience in terms of how they can move forward with returning to the office, whether they do it or they don't do it or they implement this hybrid model?
Either way it goes, flexibility is going to be critical in any transition, and this one in particular. So stay open, listen to your organization, and include them in the solution. Thank you.
Thank you all. All right. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Make sure you invite a friend. And as always, you can go to www.oaib.org if you want to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you. Bye.
Bye.